Lecture 7, China and Counterbalancing. Balance of power theory predicts that an emerging threat to the international system will provoke a counter-coalition. And in many ways, this is a puzzle because we often observe varyingly large lags. Sometimes the lags are in months, sometimes in years, sometimes in decades. And these need to be qualified and explained. Now, when we're talking about counterbalancing, we're talking not only counterbalancing against the rise of China, but counterbalancing the US, as these are the two large great powers and would be expected to balance against each other. So we're going to take a look at a number of different authors, starting in the 2010s, who focused on the phenomenon of balancing. I want to start with Steve Chan's book, China, the U.S. and Power Transition Theory, which was written in 2008, at a time before China was powerful enough to challenge the U.S. in a realistic way. Chan has been following power transition theory for a very long time, and I chose this book because it takes us to a time before China could actually challenge the U.S. And so Chan asked the question, does power transition apply to China? So at the time of the writing, which is before 2010, he argued that China was nowhere near in power levels able to challenge the U.S. It was not a revisionist state. For a preventative war to happen, in other words, for the U.S. to attack China, the U.S. has to believe that it's in an irreversible decline, which the U.S. does not believe. The U.S. is very optimistic that it can continue immigration and can spread its ideology of liberal capitalism around the world. And so China is soft balancing, did soft balance against the U.S. before 2010. Against the U.S.'s liberal strategic agenda, largely because it didn't want to be penetrated by U.S. values. But China is having difficulties catching up to the U.S. in GDP, and this was predicted as far back as then. Compromises would have to be made. When I visited the Soviet Union in 1987, I could see that jeans, coke, and rock and roll were having a significant cultural impact on consumers in the Soviet Union. And I spoke to many people there, and they were very lax in security. They had essentially abandoned the urgency of Soviet propaganda calling for a confrontation for the West, and were doing everything they could to adopt Western goods. In China, we see the same thing. In the center picture, you see the June 4th incident, 1989, where students, against corruption, made a statue of the Liberty statue in New York Harbor, showing the values in China by the youth gravitate towards the U.S. Now, currently, the Politburo in China has taken an ideological stand against what's called constitutionalism, which is the idea that individuals have legal constitutional rights, individual rights that stand against the state. And so China's fighting this. But this is, frankly, an old authoritarian stance that it's not durable, and I wouldn't bet on it. Here you can see different manifestations of China's authoritarianism, which is buying time by allowing for the type of American consumers and the people want that the Soviet Union failed to provide. This is dangerous because when people have a choice in the market, when they confront corruption, they're going to demand choice in the political system that governs the market. And the communist leadership is running a great risk here. But for them, it's the alternative is to have China ripped open and exposed to American capitalist culture without cultural guidance, and the Chinese state would then decline into large-scale corruption and organized crime. And so for the Chinese, it is a race against time. So we start with the text by Eikenberry, Mastanduno, and Wohlforth, which is Unipolarity, State Behavior, and Systematic Consequences in World Politics. And they looked at balancing responses to the U.S. and China. So we start with the puzzle of the absence of counterbalancing against the unipole. According to balance of power, whenever you have a single large power like the U.S., other countries in the international system are supposed to balance against them. So a unipolar state characteristics are that they have a preponderant dominance in all of population. So the US had a very large population, certainly not bigger than China and India, but a population that was large compared to all the other states in the system. Significant territory, giving it independence. Resource endowments. Economic capacity. For example, in 2023, the US's economy is about 25% of the world's GDP, which is fairly consistent from the early 70s, which shows the dynamism of the US economy. Military might, about 4% of the US GDP, which comes out to about 1% of the entire world's GDP is spent on the US military, and it's more than the rest of the world. The top military research and development, as well as institutional competence. The candidates for preponderant power are countries like China, who's right now ranks second in the world economy in 2023. Russia, the European Union, India, Japan. But no individual state in Europe has the power to be a candidate for being the single most powerful state in the international system. Countries have economies that grow more quickly or less quickly in response to structural and many other factors, and this affects whether they're able to take the lead position, because these countries need a strong economy in order to sustain a strong military. Furthermore, the fact that they became the largest economy often indicates they have advanced institutions for contracts, which creates trust and which creates for the efficient allocation of finance in the economy. Now, the U.S. has command of the oceans. What this means is that the U.S. with its Navy dominates the oceans. European powers have dominated the oceans since the Portuguese sailor Albuquerque entered the Indian Ocean and destroyed all the non-European fleets there. The U.S. currently has 10 aircraft carriers, which is a deep ocean method of bringing aviation and long-range hitting power into the interior of oceans where there are no islands. Aircraft carriers are always weaker than an air base on an island, but in the open ocean, they're the most powerful military system, far more powerful than surface fleets or submarine fleets or long-range maritime reconnaissance. With that capability, the U.S. is able to shut down any sea, any ocean, and to stop commerce. The U.S. has more naval aviation than the rest of the world combined. This is very similar to the British in the 1840s. When France began to build up its navy, the British lost that power. The British used to have a fleet in every single sea and ocean and could dominate world commerce and influence local politics. But with the rise of Wilhelmine Germany in the 1900s, before World War I, the British concentrated 80% of their fleet into the North Sea, which is very likely what the U.S. is going to have to do with the rise of China. So the U.S. is going to probably have to abandon the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, and even the Southern Atlantic, and focus on the North Atlantic and the Pacific, including the Asian littoral. So the U.S. can use this fleet to disrupt countries that it's hostile to. And we've seen this with the U.S. Navy backing the maritime sanctions against countries like North Korea, Venezuela, and Iran, where the U.S. Ships and their allies will stop ships at sea and search them or seize them. So command of the oceans is very, very powerful. However, countries that do terrestrial trade, like China and Russia, can obviously avoid that kind of blockade. Now, historically, large powers don't blockade other large powers because that would be a casus belli, a cause of war. But you do see the threat. And as we'll see later on in the course, there are instances where the threat of a naval blockade against commerce can lead a country to go to war sooner, which is one of the issues that China is facing. So stability of the international system, meaning the system without change caused by war, depends on the satisfaction of the U.S. If the U.S. doesn't like how things are going, they can intervene, and they have the power to, as long as they are the Unipolar. Now, states are expected to seek to change the system if the expected gains exceed the cost. In other words, a country will try to overthrow the system, like Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, if they think the risks and the costs are going to be paid off for by capturing this piece of real estate or by implementing a certain military policy. Unipolarity tends to reduce the incentive for states to balance with the unipolar. So when the U.S. was the major power, according to balance of power, countries shouldn't join the U.S. because the U.S. is going to manage the system for the other countries. That the U.S. was the center of a large international system is argued by balance of power theorists to be a lag left over from the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a major military threat. It had more nuclear weapons and more tanks and a larger army than the U.S. and NATO. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, it left NATO and the U.S. and their close allies with the same policies that they used during the Cold War. Although it would be expected that those bonds would loosen over time, which they have. Resistance to the unipole, in this case the U.S., can be manifested in a number of different ways. The first is hiding. If a state wants to avoid the influence of the U.S., they can hide. Probably by engaging in policies that are nominally supportive of the U.S., but following their own interests. Some countries do this more successfully, others less successfully, and it certainly helps to be powerful. Brazil, for example, has a fair bit of freedom because of its significant size. Myanmar, while it has been targeted for human rights violations, is protected by distance. China, of course, also has power, and so has been able to resist certain U.S. preferences. Although it's not always easy to hide. Iran has hidden far less successfully than Pakistan, even though the two countries are immediately next to each other. A second is norm entrapment, to get the U.S. embedded in institutions, and then to trap the U.S. to follow those values, with the cost that if the U.S. doesn't, it destroys the institution, which might be providing the U.S. other advantages. The UN is an example of that. The U.S. has had, during the Cold War, frequent disputes with organizations like UNESCO, which is the cultural organization, for supporting anti-Western ideologies. And the U.S. has, on occasion, along with England, stopped funding those organizations. But the U.S. is not going to abandon the UN because of that, because of the other benefits that it receives. Another strategy is binding. This is when states will ally with unipolar power to influence it. This is Canada's grand strategy. Canada sees the U.S. as a threat. The U.S. is 10 times larger economically and in terms of population than Canada, and they share a very long common border. So what Canada does is it allies with the U.S. and thereby joins many of the security institutions, such as NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense, where Canada and the U.S. jointly defend North America. Weaker states can also embed the unipoles, in this case the U.S., in international institutions. Canada's grand strategy involves embedding the U.S. in European institutions like NATO and then relying on NATO to restrain the U.S. with regard to Canada. In the same way, the U.K. uses its alliance with the U.S. to counterbalance the influence of Europe. And so Canada's major European ally is France, not England. Whenever the U.S. goes to war, Canada will only join the U.S. if France has also joined. Not if England's joined, because England does not represent anything for Canada. England would not counterbalance against the U.S. for Canada, but France will. So Canada makes a quick check. Is France going to war with the U.S.? And if the answer is yes, Canada joins the campaign because Canada cannot abandon Europe. Now, in regard to the Chinese-American relationship, it's in the Chinese perspective logical for the U.S. to be restrained within the UN system, and so China will appeal to the UN system to indicate we need to restrain the U.S. and make sure that it follows the UN rules, knowing that most of the voters in the UN are developing countries who support China's stance on a lot of issues. There's also delegitimation. A common term for delegitimation has been the rise of multipolarity. So this is describing the rise of a new set of norms which describes the U.S. influence as illegitimate, and therefore countries should organize to oppose it. Principally the influence of American culture, the influence of American businesses, the uncommon but occasional bribery and involvement of the U.S. in other countries, like the CIA during the Cold War. So delegitimation is really a way of identifying behavior in the unipole that's not considered desirable, and then to mobilize around it by trying to show that it goes against the norms. There's then soft balancing, where a country will build up, but it will not seek out hard alliances. And this was Deng Xiaoping's strategy. He was the leader that came after Mao Zedong, and he basically has a famous quote, which is, "It doesn't matter what color the cat is as long as it catches mice." And that's his metaphor for China needs to do whatever it has to do to grow economically. In the area of diplomacy, he recommended that China be restrained and not aggressive. Now, under Xi Jinping, this has become very difficult temptation to resist, because with China's economic power, it has a large military, and what leaders can do is enhance their popularity through nationalism. And where Deng Xiaoping resisted this for its obvious consequences, which is creating a counterbalancing coalition against China that involves the U.S., what Xi Jinping has done has exploited China's strength to build up a military and almost make explicit military threats against its neighbors, like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and of course it's had a combat with other countries on its border, like Laos and the Soviet Union, and in the past it's threatened Mongolia. So China's prematurely gone towards hard balancing against the unipole, particularly as it's approaching the unipole's power. You can see in the top right corner one of the Taiwanese underground airfields that's located. There's two of them that are located on the east coast of Taiwan. They've got these air bases that are able to resist a nuclear attack. You can see in the picture at the bottom the first and the second island chain. And these are areas that China would like to take control of and exclude the U.S. So China would like to control the first island chain, which would be taking over the Ryukyu Islands, currently controlled by Japan, which include Okinawa, as well as Taipei, and then to extend that island chain to include the Philippines. So that would not be the conquest of the Philippines, but the exclusion of the U.S. from Clark Field and Subic Bay, which the U.S. had during the Cold War. If the U.S. is able to deploy in the Philippines, it would be a far more useful terrestrial aircraft base than Taiwan to oppose the easy movement of a Chinese fleet from its littoral into the Pacific Ocean and Indian Oceans. And you can see the line extends all the way out to Guam. So it would also exclude the U.S. from Japan, South Korea, and other islands, although this is not seen as very realistic. The more China pushes, the more likely Japan is to base the U.S., not less likely to base the U.S. Now, hegemonic stability theory and neorealism have argued that war is unlikely in a unipolarity. Bipolarity blocks three causes of war in neorealism. Number one, uncertainty, right? Because you've got a simplistic environment, because you've only got two major powers. And so you're not going to have a war that's going to be the result of misjudgment or error, which is frequently seen as the cause of the First World War. A second is free riding. Free riding is when a country doesn't do what it should for its own security because it expects other countries to do it. So the Soviet Union, France and England did not ally during the rise of Nazi Germany in 1938-1939 because they were buck passing. The Soviet Union was hoping that Germany would focus on England and France, and the English and the French were hoping that Germany would focus on the Soviet Union, and so neither joined a common coalition that would have been sufficient to stop the Nazis going on their rampage across Europe. So we have the same issue in Asia, which is the possibility that countries like South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Philippines will, or even India, will free ride. In other words, they will allow the U.S. to do the heavy lifting, and this could lead to war. Now, for neorealists and hegemonic stability theory, the U.S. is such a large power, it's not going to wait for Japan or India to stop China. It's going to act on its own. And so free riding in a bipolar system, where you've got two overwhelmingly dominant states is not going to lead to war, because both of those states are far more powerful than their allies, and they're not going to wait for their allies. And finally, the fear of allied defection. Again, in a bipolar system, the two confronting states are so powerful, their allies are quite small. So even if Japan were to change sides and join China, it wouldn't have a major economic impact. Japan is the third largest economy in the world. It's got $4 trillion economy. However, that economy is very small compared to the European Union. So a single state changing sides is not going to have much of an effect. And so we don't expect there to be a war resulting from these tendencies of state behavior in the international system. Furthermore, whenever a state defects, countries can compensate by getting different bases, and it's a way of provoking other countries that weren't mobilized to mobilize more. So even if, say, the Philippines were to end up being very pro-Chinese, the Philippines could be compensated for by Indonesia, basically realizing that there's a threat of China in the Southeast Asian archipelago, and then they're going to double, triple their defense spending. So there's going to be a compensation for it. So the balance of power has an equilibrium with regard to dealing with threats, much of which is mediated by a lag. In other words, how long does it take for there to be an adaptation to the new system? Unipolarity tends to coincide with nuclear deterrence. The U.S. has a large nuclear arsenal, and it's used in extended deterrence. In other words, it provides nuclear protection and a guarantee of retaliation for allies like Germany and other NATO allies, Turkey, Norway, England. The U.S. extended deterrence also applies to retaliation in East Asia for Japan or South Korea. If North Korea fires a nuclear weapon at Japan or South Korea, the U.S. would retaliate immediately. So in a world of nuclear deterrence, it's very difficult to change the status quo, because if a country approaches taking territory that's core or a vital territory from another country, it'll lead to a nuclear exchange, and that nuclear exchange, the costs inflicted will almost always be greater than whatever gain was hoped for. So China taking over Taiwan is important for its domestic legitimacy, and it gives it a piece of strategic territory, but it's not worth a full-scale nuclear exchange. Now, it is possible that you could have a war under a nuclear umbrella where the U.S. and China restrain use of their nuclear arsenals. Certainly, Nazi Germany in World War II did not use its nerve gases on the battlefields in the Soviet Union or against France or England, although it could have. It was a choice, largely restraint created by the retaliatory threat of gas on German cities. A second phenomenon that tends to coincide with unipolarity is the declining benefits of conquest. And this is largely because of nationalism. Even if the U.S. were able to conquer a territory, the local population's resistance would make the costs of occupation high, particularly for a democracy. Now, obviously, this depends. In the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, far and away the most expensive part of the occupation, of the conquest, was the occupation where once a target country is conquered, there's an obligation felt by the domestic political processes of democracies to rebuild those countries. And it's not uncommon for countries to recognize this tendency. There was a sailor on the Yamato, the largest Japanese battleship, in his diary, who recorded a conversation with another sailor. This is at the end of World War II, when Japan was expecting to lose, and ultimately the Yamato was sunk by the U.S. Navy, the world's largest battleship, and killing the sailor who was in the conversation. But the diary survived, and it said, you know what? We're going to get defeated by the U.S., but then they're just going to rebuild us, and we're going to go back to what we were before, which is, precisely what happened when the U.S. Threatened Japan in the 1850s and compelled it to have commercial treaties with outside countries. So, nationalism makes conquest expensive. So, at least for democracy. Now, with regard to Taiwan, China's demonstrated in Hong Kong that totalitarian states can actually have reduced costs for occupation. A problem with that argument is that China spends an awful lot on the domestic occupation of its own society. The amount of money spent on governing its own society, policing it coercively, the amount of money spent is close to what it spends on its military. A third trend today is democratization. The fact that having unipolar power, it's difficult to overthrow unipolar power that's democratic with other democracies because democracies don't fight each other. And so there's a lot of maneuvering, but there's not much countries can do to each other economically through military force. They can certainly create free trade zones that exclude each other, but you're not going to be able to resolve economic issues militarily when you're dealing with a community of democracies. And the other issue is that democracies will generally protect each other and will resist associating with a non-democracy unless that non-democracy is vital to resist another non-democracy. So in other words, China's pushing out against East Asian cultures, but because these East Asian cultures like South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, and the Philippines are democratic, they have a natural inclination to ally with the US and not China. And so the unipoles are also self-reinforcing because they engage in competition against each other. So you have an action-reaction cycle. And this means the US and China will focus more and more on each other. This is a natural process. It can be distorting, but it's not clear that it is in the case of the US and China. We might have the opposite effect, which is that there's been a lag because of the US's international responsibilities. So the US has been much slower to react to China because of policy distractions in the Near East and in Eastern Europe. So the probability of war has often been associated with power transition. This is a part of hegemonic stability theory, the idea that you've got one great power dominating the international institutions and the political institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the United Nations that back the economic regime that the world is operating. When a large power loses influence, then it's going to be supplanted by another great power, but very often this happens with violence. Now, the US replaced the UK without violence because they were strategic allies. The Soviet Union never got close to the US economy, even though it had more military power. With China, however, there's been a cottage industry of predictions when China is going to surpass the US. The earliest projection was 2013, 2014, which you see here. And I started teaching this class in the end of the 20th century. And at that time, China's economy was less than that of England. And then China grew enormously quickly from around 2000 to 2010 and caught up to the US. In reality, if you look at the kind of mistakes that were made analyzing the size of the Soviet economy during the Cold War, when the Cold War ended, the strength of the Soviet economy was revised down by 50%. So a lot of this is conjecture by economists who are pursuing various different political ideas, but who are not necessarily guided by strict principles of measurement of the economy. Now, there's two ways to measure an economy. You could do nominal GDP, gross domestic product, which looks at the economic activity for a year, and you could look at purchasing power parity. Now, there's two large distortions in China. The first is that about a third of the Chinese economy is in valued real estate. And this is the problem for actually evaluating the true value of those transactions. Now, it's not the amount of held real estate, it's the amount of sold and bought real estate. Japan had the same issue in the 1990s and the 1980s. It was the fastest growing economy in the world. It had a wildly disproportionate impact on industrialization and on industrial exports, but then it stopped innovating around 1990, and its economy got stuck, partially for demographic reasons, but mostly for structural reasons. You had a paternalistic, hierarchical economic system which deterred new entrants in the economy. So Nobel Prize winning Japanese mostly went to work in the US as academics or for industry, and Japanese startups just were suffocated by the red tape. Ultimately, Japan's economy deflated significantly because of loss of value in the real estate. And that's what could happen to China. The second issue is purchasing power parity versus GDP, nominal GDP. Purchasing power parity looks at quality of life by looking at the actual items that people use and then trying to find some sort of comparative value. An American living in an apartment compared to someone in China living in an apartment live very similar lives in terms of the quality of the apartment, the proximity to the market, the choice of foods they have, the size of their television set, the quality of their phone. Perhaps there's a difference in the availability of an automobile, but if you're living in San Francisco or living on Manhattan, you probably don't have an automobile. So the problem, however, with purchasing power parity is what would the American pay to live where and how the Chinese individual is living, and what would the Chinese individual pay to live where the American is living. And there you can see the differences in trade. Nominal GDP much more accurately captures two phenomena. One, what is sellable on the international system. So while the lifestyle might be roughly equivalent in that it's appropriate for their respective cultures, in an exchange, the American's lifestyle is a lot more desirable. And so nominal GDP is much more useful for measuring the tradable value of a country's economy. Secondly, nominal GDP is much more useful at the moment for measuring industrial output, manufacturing output. And so nominal GDP is a more accurate measurement of how a country could fight in a war, since manufacturing strength will determine the availability of weapons. Now here in the chart you can see that the economic transition should have occurred between China and the US around 2013, 2014, but never occurred. In the past, countries like Wilhelmine Germany in the First World War, it's thought that as Wilhelmine Germany's economy approached that of England, particularly in manufacturing, you would have a conflict. Now, a conflict can occur at many different parts of the intersection. In the Wilhelmine German case, it's thought that Germany was getting more and more powerful. Rhetorically, it was declaring that it would surpass England, and then it slowed down. Because all countries slow down their economies as they approach the leader, because the leading country typically, like the US or England before it, or the Dutch before them, have advantages in innovation. And innovating is expensive, and so growth rates naturally slow down as countries try to master the technology. So Wilhelmine Germany is thought to have attacked England because suddenly it couldn't catch up to England anymore. The German economy slowed down, and so it basically wanted to leap ahead using military force. So if it couldn't economically bypass, it could attack the English. Another explanation is that once a challenging power passes by the older power, it then starts a war because it needs to adjust the institutions, the international system. So it has to capture territory and knock the older power out. Another prediction is that the power that is maintaining the international system will attack the challenging power before it surpasses it. I mean, this is logical for it to do. However, because many of the most powerful countries in the world today are democracies, democracies generally do not engage in preventative war. There was the exception of the U.S. attacking Iraq in 2003 to stop Iraq's nuclear weapons program, but it's not clear if that was the actual defining goal of the U.S. attack on Iraq in 2003. These are the different inflection points for the link between economic transition, power transition, and war initiation. So here you can see a similar prediction of when this is from the IMF, that China's economy would surpass the US around 2014. This never came to pass. And here you can see the latest projection. This is from 2021, and so the transition has now been projected to 2028. Now this is important because once China passes the US, it can out-manufacture the US, and so not only can it provide more foreign aid, and therefore get countries on its side, it can also open up its market for imports from developing countries, and this will win them over to China's system. And finally, in the event of war, it can build more weapons than the US can, and will eventually win on the battlefield. Although wars begin with a lightning attack, generally speaking, they settle down in a conflict of attrition, where the countries learn from each other, and so they end up being approximately even in their military efficiency, and the real determinant is the amount of weaponry that can be built. Now, there are major differences between the U.S. and China, the first is China's economy, its market is not open for importation from the developing world. China exports the same as these other countries would import into China. And so China's a closed economy, much more closed than the U.S. for imports. China will import primary products, but it'll be difficult for them to create a common market with countries that are basically relying on their comparative advantage in order to participate in a common economic trading system. So that's not going to work. And China's foreign policy lending, while the money is certainly welcome, it can be domestically disruptive. So it doesn't always win friendship in the countries that it's lending money to. Particularly for those countries that are approaching democracy, their values are far closer to the U.S. in terms of anti-corruption and human rights. So in the delegitimation in balance of power politics, you can imagine that there's a constant hope for countries that are against the Unipolar, in today's case against the U.S., to dream of multipolarity. Now, mainstream realists predict that a multipolar system emerging is natural as other countries mimic the same technologies and the institutions and then catch up to the Unipolar. And, this is largely how the English caught up to the Dutch, and that the Germans caught up to the English, and the U.S. caught up to England. There's a copying of institutions. This is not an easy process. A great many countries in the world resist engaging in the type of social reforms that bring them power. Mexico has persistently refused to incorporate the culture and the institutions that they see just across the border that makes the U.S. so incredibly wealthy, where Canada, which is equally close, has adopted those same values. So sometimes countries mimic, sometimes they don't. This should be distinguished from the rhetorical call by politicians for a rise of a multipolar system. A multipolar system would represent the decline of the U.S., and this is what anti-U.S. Politicians have been declaring is about to happen since the beginning of the Cold War, that the U.S. would be replaced by other great powers. Even if the U.S. was not the most powerful country in the system, as far as the major powers go, it's one of the most trusted, which is why it has an alliance system that follows it around based on values, particularly its association with Europe and the democratic states of the Pacific littoral. So let's be careful about the realist prediction of a multipolar system and the rhetorical call for a multipolar system. The multipolar system can also be seen as a negative for countries like China, because when China becomes a great power, it's no longer going to be a bipolar system, China versus the U.S. It will be a multipolar system where it will be China versus the U.S. versus India versus the European Union, versus perhaps other centers of power. So China is not coming into a new system where it alone will be the most powerful. It's coming into a system where there's many other countries vying for an important say in the international system's structure. Now, there are different types of multipolarity and the type of countries that operate within it. The first are, of course, the supporters. Those are the countries that support the Unipolar, in this case the U.S., or prospectively would support China. There are the shirkers, countries that free ride, that don't really want to get involved. They'll participate economically, but they won't participate strategically, and they won't push any of the values militarily. A good example would be Brazil. Brazil is involved in peacekeeping in areas like the Caribbean on a large scale. It had a peacekeeping force in Haiti for quite a while. But Brazil is not committed to spreading democracy aggressively in Asia and Africa like the European states are. And finally, there are spoilers, countries which are resisting the distribution of power in the international system. These are countries whose interests don't fit with the Unipol. Countries like Venezuela and Iran, which is threatening the U.S.'s allies in the region, Saudi Arabia and Israel, and other countries like Vietnam for a time when it was supporting the Soviet Union. So there are different positions countries can have in a multipolar system. Now, ultimately, the change in the comparative economies of the countries is driven by what Lenin described as the law of uneven economic growth. This was developed by Gilpin, a political scientist in political economy. And I mean, the essential logic is that power comes from economic growth, and predicting economic growth is therefore what analysts should focus on. Inevitably, you're going to get a diffusion of technology in the system, so that people are going to end up having cheaper access to this common technology, and they're going to be able to catch up late. Now, you can see the graph here. The graph on the bottom left shows the rapid rise of China's population in the 1980s and 1990s. It added more people than the population the U.S. had at the time of this picture. Although the U.S. Its population is closer to 400 million if you include residents. You can see on the bottom right the projection of the China and U.S. economy. And what's interesting is that because of China's demographic issues, it's expected that the U.S. might be able to, even if China becomes the largest economy in 2030, the U.S. will likely regain the position of being the largest economy in 2060. And this is because China's population is getting very old, and they've got very severe limits in terms of soil. So China's going to become very dependent on food importation, energy importation, and it's going to have a very old population needs to support. And you can also see the aggressive rise of India as it learns in how to industrialize and participate in an export-oriented economy. Now, in the delegitimation phase of a rebalancing in the international system, you can imagine that countries will challenge the Unipol not using power, but using the norms of the international institutions. Now, reputations tend to be sticky. The reputation a country has for its past actions tend to remain for quite a while. And this is good and bad. But it means that a country's behavior definitely has an impact on its long-term prospects for winning other allies. And the reputations of a country could also diverge from its underlying power. So the U.S. might become weaker over time relative to China, but still have that same status as a viable core leader of most of the countries in the international system. Now, in a delegitimation phase, the challenger, in this case China, would rise to challenge the hegemon's world order. So it's not really balancing at this stage. It's not preparing a military force or creating alliances to challenge the U.S., but rather it's resisting the U.S.'s interpretation of the international system. So China as a challenger will shirk at this stage of delegitimization. In other words, it will not join U.S. efforts to spread democracy, to spread liberal capitalism, and commercial exchange as a way of building the world economy. It will sit back and let the major Unipol, the U.S., expend all the resources. So delegitimization tends to come before balancing. And so if you think a country is going to balance, meaning organize alliances and to build up its military to challenge the Unipol, you would expect them to challenge the country in terms of its values. And this is what China did before Xi Jinping came to power. Once he came to power, China went into balancing. Now, balancing is a revisionist rather than a status quo behavior in a Unipol. A status quo power like the U.S. and its European and democratic allies in Asia is not going to engage in balancing. The challenger will. The challenger will seek out other countries to ally with it, like North Korea and Pakistan and Iran and Myanmar and Zimbabwe and Venezuela, in the case of and Russia in the case of China, and will act as more aggressive. And so delegitimization is often necessary to try to wean the U.S. away from its allies. Now, rightful resistance used by a rising power will be used to win greater prestige. So China will say, we are addressing past injustices, like the century of shame, domestically. But internationally, it'll say, we need a multipolarity. The U.S. is hegemonic. It's a bully. We don't want the U.S. to interfere in your domestic political systems. The problem with that demand is it's very often anti-revolutionary. It's basically telling authoritarian states, we support you against U.S. attempts to get the population to recognize their human rights and overthrow you. So peculiarly, China's becoming the more conservative power, and the U.S. has dominance because of its revolutionary ideology of human rights. Now, this may unintentionally deepen the legitimacy of the unipolar order. I mean, if China's trying to overthrow the system with an unpopular ideology, the U.S. is going to be reinforced. Countries are going to say, we like the U.S. values. And one by one, China's allies will drop by. We have the peculiar outcome that one of China's closest allies, Pakistan, is providing a lot of help to Ukraine on behalf of the Western states. And it's doing this because Pakistan is not only China's ally, they're also a Western ally. They have a robust democracy. They're also an Islamic country, so they have close relations with Saudi Arabia. And they have a significant Shia population and many common issues with Iran. So they also have good relations there. So Pakistan is pulled in many different directions, and China can't assume that a country is going to necessarily follow its linear strategic interests. So China's challenge to the U.S. is first denouncing U.S. unilateralism, the idea that the U.S. is somehow bullying countries to do things. This is partially true. Sometimes the U.S. acts unilaterally with the expectation other countries will follow it and support it. And certainly the U.S.'s hunch on Iraq was true, which is the democracy in Iraq, while it's relatively fragile and built around the ethnic Shia, it has been stable. It's been fairly persistent and hasn't resulted in a slew of military coups, which occurred to a lot of the decolonized states in Africa in the 1960s and 1970s. China wants to create new international organizations, which it's done. And there's been some frustration by East Asian states that under U.S. President Donald Trump, the U.S. was reluctant to get involved in these organizations because the U.S. was raising its tariffs to reindustrialize not only vis-a-vis China, but vis-a-vis other countries like Japan and Germany, which are its allies. 3, soft balancing in the developing world. China is demonstrating that it's giving aid to the rest of the world, and it should be recognized, and other countries should therefore cooperate with it. There's a lot of anti-Western sentiment. Countries like South Africa, for example, have a tendency to want to support the Russia because of the Soviet legacy that was anti-apartheid, and the fact that the Soviet Union supported the African National Congress that overthrew the government there. And so these same types of anti-Western, revolutionary, anti-colonial societies are more likely to support China. Number 4, voting against the U.S. in international organizations. So China will veto resolutions against its allies, particularly North Korea. Although it's a balancing act because China doesn't really control North Korea, and so sometimes it will allow some of the resolutions not to be vetoed. But this shows that China has strategic interests that oppose the U.S. And 5, agenda setting in regional organizations. It wants to dominate what is being pursued and also shut down policies it doesn't support, particularly in Central Asia and Southeast Asia. You can see in the graph on the bottom left the rapid rise in per capita income in China, where it was a tiny fraction of the U.S. per capita income. 2010, it was less than 1/10, and by 2021, it was about 1/6 of the U.S. per capita income. So some of the delegitimization slogans being pursued by China is traditional Chinese culture. This is a superior system. And it means that China's trying to let other countries know that other countries can preserve their traditional domestic political order without requiring and achieve economic wealth without having to change their actual system to an American one. Now, this is partially dishonest. China achieved economic growth because of the Cultural Revolution. It destroyed traditional culture. It trained an industrial workforce to show up on time. And so China, in many ways, it didn't westernize. It industrialized in exactly the same way that Western countries were de-westernized and industrialized. Every country in the world that wants to industrialize has to have disciplined manufacturing labor. And so there's no escape to this. So China's promise is disingenuous. Ultimately, all of these countries will have to engage in the same level of discipline if they're going to pay back the loans that China has lent them. China promises great harmony. Now, this again, this is not entirely convincing. It works for China if it's appealing to South America or the Middle East or Africa, where there's the long shadow of the U.S. And these countries have experienced interference in their domestic politics by the U.S. But this is not a very appealing strategy in East Asia, where China has been very provocative to all of its neighbors. And finally, there's the developmental model. I mean, China shows, look at us, we've grown very, very quickly, you can do business with us, you don't have to do business with the U.S. And for many countries that are corrupt in the developing world, and China's making no demands for the country not to be corrupt, this is an appealing system. But it's not going to last. If China wants to get repaid, the countries will have to become less corrupt. Otherwise, the money will simply disappear into offshore bank accounts. And so most of these slogans are entirely disingenuous. China's predictably going to follow an American model. Now, the American model, of course, is capitalism over socialism, right? But, I mean, these are sort of empty ideological rants. What you're really looking at is welfare. I mean, what provides people better welfare? American capitalism or American socialism? One thing that America is not is safe. And this is important, especially for immigrants coming from countries like China, which are a lot safer and have dealt with low-level corruption. So coming to the U.S., it can be a bit alienating if one is an immigrant and doesn't integrate and doesn't speak the local language as well as the local population. So for a lot of East Asians, for example, they wildly are overrepresented in the elite schools in the U.S., but there's what's called a bamboo ceiling, which is because they don't speak English very well, East Asians tend not to be as heavily represented in graduate schools or in corporate leadership. And people from other regions like South Asia, who have a much better command of the language, have a much higher level of domination at those upper levels. There's also democracy versus dictatorship. I mean, the U.S. is selling a system that is actually revolutionary and is very appealing to middle-income countries where you've got authoritarian leaders. And China and Russia are, of course, terrified of this as colonial societies because one of the principles of democracy is self-determination, and so multi-ethnic remnant empires would be broken up. And so while the U.S. makes authoritarian countries and countries with corrupt leaderships very, very nervous and therefore likely to bend over to China, the population pushing for human rights almost never does it in the name of Chinese ideology. Cosmopolitanism, the idea that the laws that apply in one place apply everywhere, so that the U.S. has to treat foreigners in its country the same as it treats local people. And this is not true for many nationalist states like China, which clearly privilege their own party and their own people. And so this creates essentially a much lower level of trust with China. And the U.S. Support for individual rights and freedoms. Certainly individual rights is partially cultural. When you have collectivist societies, and you can have a collectivist society in places like Sweden, for example, where you have many cultural traits that are very similar to Japan, where the individual's identity is submerged in the common population. And this makes for a high level of cohesion. But these are also the formula that create depression and suicide. So it's not entirely clear that they're desirable. But just broadly speaking, the fact that there are laws that protect individuals, because even in a collectivist society, you're always going to get people that sort of stand out from the normal. Here's Ai Weiwei. He helped design the Olympic Stadium in China. He was the child of an artist in China. And even though he was for a long time iconic of avant-garde art in China, he actually grew up in New York with his father and experienced the American art scene. Went back to China, engaged in a lot of beautiful art, was eventually jailed for tax evasion, obviously trumped up charges because of the rather wild tax system in China, and then he left China. And so currently he's abroad. But here he's obviously doing one of his antisocial artistic displays. Now, in pursuit of this renegotiated international order, China's building up its navy. Now, one of the hypotheses that comes out of the literature is that naval powers, unlike terrestrial powers like France and Germany in 1870, or France and Germany in 1914 or 1940, their military buildups tend to be less threatening, and so balancing occurs more slowly. So you can see here the rise of China's fleet. If you look at the chart in 2019 on the top right, you'll see 2 aircraft carriers in the left column, which is China's aircraft carriers, and the 10 American aircraft carriers. Now, China's got a 3rd carrier there. In the cruisers category, China's now got 3 cruisers, and the U.S. has got 22 cruisers. These are vital. They're basically systems that coordinate anti-ship and anti-air systems to protect the aircraft carriers. You've got a large number of destroyers. China's got a large number of frigates for escorting. The U.S. would generally rely on its allies to do the escorting of commerce while it fights the main fleet actions. And you've got littoral combat ships that would be useful in the closed waters of Southeast Asia. The Chinese have a lot of short-range diesel submarines, non-nuclear, which are inexpensive and quiet. But the U.S. has the lead in nuclear submarines, which have a capacity for covering great distances, and it will take decades for China to build up an equivalent submarine fleet, which is important. So a question that comes up frequently is the likelihood of the weaker countries in Asia of bandwagoning with China. This comes from Robert Ross's article, The Balance of Power, Politics, and the Rise of China in Security Studies. So secondary states bandwagon in response to power and not economic interdependence. So there's a lot of concern because most of South Korea's and Taiwan's economy is with mainland China, as well as Japan. But the historical evidence shows that they're going to bandwagon with China if they're isolated and they're alone and there's no counterbalancing force, but not because of economic interdependence. Because economic interdependence is about profits, but invasion and could lead to a loss of life and a loss of control over property. Economic interdependence is not sufficient, at least in historical cases, for a country to let itself be dominated by another country. But very often, economic domination coincides with the threat of military domination, and then we end up focusing wrongly at economic dominance being the principal variable, which is not true. So Confucian values and regime types are historically not factors. The fact that South Korea and North Korea are Confucian and China is Confucian, it was not a factor. It was the fact that China was overwhelmingly powerful that led those countries to associate with China. Now, for North Korea, clearly there's an advantage. They're not so much bandwagoning with China as acting wildly, knowing that China is going to protect them because China does not want South Korea to be unified on its border, because South Korea and North Korea not only would be a powerful industrialized state, but also be allies of the U.S. So it's very unlikely that the Republic of China or the Republic of Korea would bandwagon with China. Now, Kai He, in his article Dynamic Balancing in the Journal of Contemporary China, examined a number of hypotheses of China's balancing behavior. And the first hypothesis is that in a bipolarity, China would engage in external balancing. In effect, it would play off against the center. And this is what it did between 1949, when the communists took over, and 1991. And in fact, this applies equally well in the pre-communist stage during the Kuomintang, and even earlier than that when the Qing dynasty before 1911 was in power. So it's just natural for China to ally with any available power to balance against the largest single threat to the system, which during the Cold War for China was the US. China adopted a communist system, but not only that, it was territorially threatening emerging countries on the Pacific littoral, some of them democratic, like Japan, but most of them simply wanting to be independent. And U.S. grand strategy is essentially a copy of English grand strategy, which is that there should be no unification of the Eurasian landmass. For the English, it was no unification in Europe, because if ever Europe or you had a single state encompassing Europe and Asia, then that would be such a concentration of power that it would overwhelm all of the other continents. So the goal is to keep the regions divided. And so U.S. grand strategy was to split communist China from the Soviet Union. And that's one of the reasons why the U.S. went for a stalemate and a negotiated ceasefire in the Korean War, and why the U.S. did not invade North Vietnam. The U.S. could have easily invaded North Vietnam and destroyed it, but that would have alienated China, pushed it in the arms of the Soviet Union. Because the U.S. didn't do that, China spun away from the Communist alliance. There were ideological disputes after the Soviet Union refused to support China in the Second Taiwan Straits crisis. The USSR did not want to risk a nuclear war over Little Taiwan. China wanted to risk it under Mao Zedong. So in 1959, China criticized the Soviet Union at a meeting of communist ideologues. And then there were increasing border disputes after China detonated its bomb in 1964, culminating in the 1969 Sino-Soviet border conflict, in which several thousand died. And then the Soviet Union moved 1/3 of their military to oppose China in the 1970s through the 1980s, which was brought great relief to NATO, because a significant portion of the Soviet Union's attention was somewhere else. The second hypothesis is of multipolarity, that China's external and internal balancing, and this is Kenneth Waltz's term for external balancing is making allies, and internal balancing is building up weapons. So at this time, China would be unstable. It wouldn't be very strong, but it's trying to give itself the means to resist external powers and to acquire the allies that would eventually be available in the future. Now, China's lost a lot of allies. Indonesia under Sukarno was sympathetic to China, as was Yugoslavia and Albania. But over time, many of these countries democratized. The authoritarian regimes that were originally sympathetic to China have gone, and so China's, in some respects, traded some allies for other allies. And the third hypothesis is that at the unipolar stage, China will be engaging in internal balancing. In other words, it's going to focus on building up its military. And this is what it did between 1999 and 2005. And here it's going for great power domination. It's essentially seeking a role to dominate the international system. You can see here various polls favoring China versus the U.S., but this is quite an old chart, and it shows from the before 2010. So this shows you at the time, before China became very militarily assertive, that there were a lot of countries that were deferential to China. But this has decreased over time. And generally, the deference to China is mostly driven by anti-U.S. or anti-Western sentiment. So, Egypt, obviously, they're hostile to the U.S. support to Israel. Argentina is anti-U.S. Because of the last Malvinas conflict in 1982, the fight over the Falklands War. Pakistan, of course, is very pro-China because it needs it to fend off India. Now, Jack Levy, in his Power Transition Theory and the Rise of China, in the text China's Ascent, examined China and a power transition war. And he argues that the balance of power applies to continental and terrestrial Europe. So if you're trying to figure out, the balance of power, of course, argues that whenever you have a rising power, you're going to have some sort of lag, but countries will eventually create an alliance to counterbalance this new threat to the international system, because this new power is going to want to reorder who owns what piece of territory. Now, this applies to land powers. Hegemonic stability and power transition apply to global maritime hegemonies. In other words, countries that have large navies that dominate commerce. So it'll apply to the rise of the British Empire, which is primarily disparate territories united by the Royal Navy and by the US, which engages in a lot of commerce and has a large navy, but is not out for territorial conquest. It's simply trying to spread its ideology. So balance of power applies on land. Hegemonic stability and power transition, which is what we're looking at here with China and the US, applies for maritime hegemony, which is what China's going for by building up its fleet. Now, the risk of war happens when the challenger is at 80% of the dominant state's economy, which is what China is now. Now, it's not rational for a country that's only at 80% to start a war. But what very often happens, as mentioned earlier, is that its economy starts to slow down, and the rhetoric of it eventually overtaking the other country fails. And then you have an incentive for it to find an excuse in order to make up the difference through a military strategy, which inevitably fails. I found, however, that many of these countries engage in disputes which then escalate. And then the U.S. finds an opportunity to bleed these countries until they're defeated. So the U.S. was not happy that Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. But once it had, the U.S. made a determination not to let Iraq survive. And so they dismantled it. The U.S. engaged in a similar strategy against Serbia and its involvement in Bosnia. And many are concerned that China is going to be tricked into a war, and then the U.S. is going to bleed them, which is one of the claimed strategies of Russia in Ukraine. Right? Now, there's no evidence that the U.S. Wanted Russia to attack Ukraine, or they want China to attack Taiwan, but clearly the U.S. has an incentive once these countries make a mistake. And they are prone to make a mistake when they are led by leaders who want to leave a legacy. In the case of Taiwan, Xi Jinping would cement his rule by recapturing Taiwan, even though for him personally, Taiwan does not matter that much. And so China is already at the 80% cutoff, but the precise risk of war can be calculated, but to my knowledge, it hasn't yet been calculated. So power is generally the population times per capita GDP. Plus political capacity, and this leads to power. So a status quo dominant states do not initiate preventative wars because it challenges the norms of the system, reducing the dominant state's support. So we would not expect the U.S. To start the conflict. A major issue is the veracity of the reporting by the Chinese government about its growth rates. The growth rates matter for the legitimacy of the Communist Party in Beijing because of the large unemployed youth population, which we can see with the anti-COVID riots, are more influential than the older population that are the traditional support base for the Communist Party. So China simply cannot ignore the youth and the high level of unemployment among the youth. And so when they declare a high growth rate, it's because they're showing that they're contributing to the population as a whole. The problem is, for China, is whether the figures are accurate. China may go to a confrontational stance against the U.S. based on the perception of its economic strength, which may be much weaker. Here, University of Chicago professor Luis Martinez argues that China's growth rate is only about 40% of what they report. And so China's economy is actually much weaker than what we think it is. Now, Alan Whitting has been a scholar of Chinese security for decades. In his international security article in 2001, he examined China's use of force up until 1996, which is a pretty good indicator because China was most free to use force because it was not incorporated in the international system and had alliances with the Soviet Union, or was military strong enough to choose to fight. So it's a very good indicator of what China will do in the future. So Alan Whitting asks the question, can China be deterred? Which is an important question now that China's got enough power that it can choose to use military force. Can other countries adopt a stance to stop China from engaging in aggressive behavior? Now, he finds that China is very often deliberately taking risks in its foreign policy with the use of force. Some of the characteristics. One, it has an exaggerated threat perception from the outside. It sees the U.S. as genuinely trying to corrupt it by leveraging its influence in China's domestic population, which is why China's got the Great Firewall. China accepts risk when it's dealing against a superior enemy, and what else can it do? So the logic would be to hit the enemy very hard with surprise and to dislocate its domestic population. And China believes that in the case of the Korean War and China's intervention in 1950, it did this, resulting in the removal of UN and U.S. General Douglas MacArthur by U.S. President Harry Truman, as well as causing the U.S. to cut back their goal of unifying Korea and simply of reinstating the status quo ante of a ceasefire along the approximate 38th parallel, which is where North and South Korea were divided before the war started. The third is risk management. China might be engaging in risk behavior, but it's got a strategy to terminate the violence, to absorb the risks and the costs, and to limit them. Fourth, advanced deterrence warning. China almost always gives a warning beforehand, although it's not always understood. China sent a message through India to the U.S. for the U.S. not to approach the North Korean-Chinese border along the Yalu, or China would intervene. And it was a message that was not clearly received in the West. And Douglas MacArthur was exaggerating the U.S.'s ability to defeat a Chinese counterattack. And number five, China generally preempts and seizes the initiative. Because it's the weaker power, it wants to move quickly and get first mover advantage. Because it's moving alone, it doesn't have allies, and the allies are not liberal, China's not alienating its allies by behaving aggressively. However, it provokes counterbalancing. And a large problem of China's self-encirclement is because it acted so aggressively historically. In Korea in 1950, China had a deterrence failure and demonstrated all of these. It saw the U.S. arriving on the Yalu River between North Korea and China as a threat, because the U.S. would be only 200 kilometers away from taking Beijing. The U.S. is a far superior country with a nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union had just acquired a nuclear arsenal in 1949, but certainly didn't have any weapons that could support China if the U.S. started dropping nuclear weapons on China. So China managed the risk. I mean, they recognized the bounds of the risk and the costs, and they operated through it. They did give advanced deterrence warning through India, and they preempted. They moved secretly into North Korea, several 100,000 soldiers, and then they attacked the U.S. aggressively and pushed the UN down south past Seoul. So we talked about the first case of Korea. We have the offshore island disputes. These are the Taiwan Straits crises in 1954 and 55 and 1958, where China was capturing or shelling and bombing the Taiwanese islands of Quemoy and Matsu, which are located just a few kilometers off the Chinese coast. There were threats in the Taiwan Straits in June of 1962. In 1962, China attacked India, seizing the initiative, capturing the Aksai Chin. We'll look at this case later on. North Vietnam, China was helping North Vietnamese with their infrastructure and their air defense against the U.S. China had a border clash with the Soviet Union, and this was at a time that there was significant domestic disturbances in China, and the Communist Party was hollowed out. So it seems likely that the border clash was instigated by a leadership that was influenced by the young Revolutionary Guards in China. China attacked Vietnam in 1979. So in all these cases, China acted aggressively according to the principles identified by Alan Whiting. Now, the implications for Taiwan are important. So the implications for Taiwan is that China is willing to risk a Pyrrhic victory. This is named after Pyrrhus of Epirus, who's a Greek general who's very skilled, who attacked Rome, and he won a series of victories just barely at enormous cost, because the Romans were difficult to defeat. So although all the battles were won, so many soldiers died, eventually Pyrrhus of Epirus went back to Greece. Now, the implication for Taiwan is that China might go for a war that will result in enormous losses, both for the U.S. and for China. But this is a part of their calculation to inflict costs on countries that are essentially acting counter to Chinese interests in their region. So this would involve the U.S. military forces and could involve secondary ground forces like Marines operating in Taiwan or in the islands of the South China Sea. An early warning is very unlikely. Now, it's certainly possible to watch the Chinese military build up in the ports prior to an attack on Taiwan, but a lot of the forces, the helicopter forces, the airborne, they can move without any warning at all, because they can move just within a few hours to the aircraft, and the fighter aircraft are already deployed opposite Taiwan. Japan could deny the use of Okinawa, depending on domestic politics, although Japan is definitely moving in a much more aggressive position. There tend to be typhoons between May and November, so it's unlikely China will move at that time, because it needs to be able to resupply its forces conducting either a blockade or a landing. Ultimately, China's goal is negotiating. So it'll engage in an attack, it'll inflict a shock. It won't necessarily try to conquer Taiwan, but that shock is meant to force the domestic American population to face the costs of war and then to negotiate a peace favorable to China. Now, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping both miscalculated over Taiwan. And Jiang Zemin also miscalculated when he fired rockets over Taiwan in 1995, 1996 to influence the elections there. And so it's not entirely clear that China's policy is rational. It seems like you've got a closed organization without a lot of external experience in international politics, making relatively simplistic estimates of the situation. And China, you've got this constant focus on trouble within, trouble without. In other words, if there's weakness within China, even if that weakness is not caused by external forces, the weakness, because it can be exploited, China has an incentive to aggressively challenge the external forces before they exploit that social division. Now, this could come in the form of student demonstrations, demanding less corruption, demanding more liberalism, demanding more political representation. China might be compelled, under those circumstances, to move against Taiwan, essentially as a message to the U.S., if you do anything in our sphere, we're going to act aggressively. And this is a part of Beijing's worst case analysis. Now, John J. Mearsheimer, in his Tragedy of the Great Power Politics, in which he has essentially an offensive realist conception of the world, which is very simply, in the world, every country wants to become the hegemon in their region. Like the U.S., it dominated North America. Mexico, the Caribbean, and Canada are in complete abeyance to the U.S. Every other country in the world is trying to do the same thing, but they've failed because the U.S. will use its Navy to project power and deploy bases in not the most powerful country in other continents, but the second most powerful country, to stop the most powerful country from achieving dominance. So the U.S. uses Pakistan against India, Japan and Taiwan against China. It uses England against Germany, and it uses Germany against Russia. And it uses its multiple allies in South America against Brazil and Argentina, and so on. So in this conception, countries will behave in a very risky, aggressive fashion if they have the opportunity to take over a continent. And so this is Mearsheimer's explanation for World War II. Adolf Hitler, in his conception, was behaving rationally, as were the Imperial Japanese. They were gambling but with a very high payoff of having the same level of continental domination that the U.S. achieved, with all of the benefits of increased security. The U.S., for example, is very secure in its own continent. No country in the region comes close to threatening the U.S. And this allows the U.S. to have demilitarized borders along Mexico and Canada. Now, Mearsheimer estimates that China will become a great power with 4 times the latent power of the U.S. if its economic growth continues. It's not entirely clear how he made that estimate, but and it seems to run counter to some of the more restrained estimates of China's long-term economic potential. But this is what China could do if China catches up per capita-wise to the U.S., right? Which may or may not occur. South Korea, after 40 years, caught up to Japan, and today in 2023, it's got practically the same per capita income. This is very rare. Most middle-income countries get stuck halfway towards their development. Now, U.S. foreign policy is to make China wealthy and integrated. And Mearsheimer argues this is a very bad policy. The liberals argue it's a good policy, because by creating a middle class in China, they're going to adopt liberal policies and eventually overthrow the authoritarian system in China that's pro-war. But Mearsheimer argues that long before that middle class is created, China will have enough power to overturn the international system, despite its middle class, which will be too small to influence politics. Wilhelmine Germany had a middle class. It had an active legislature, but they were not strong enough to keep the Kaiser from leading Germany into the First World War. So China needs to secure East Asia and become the hegemon in the region. That's the Chinese goal. But because of islands like Japan, which are difficult to capture, and Taiwan and the Philippines, it might be difficult for China to achieve that power. And its northern border is occupied by a rapidly weakening but still Soviet, a nuclear weapons armed Russian state. So this comes down to the final question: when will China surpass the U.S.? Now, it was confidently predicted that given growth rates, China would surpass the U.S. economy in 2020. But it didn't come to pass, as we looked at in some of the earlier slides. Jonathan Moyer, in Measuring and Forecasting the Rise of China in the Journal of Contemporary China in 2022, estimated that looking at all the ingredients of power, including economic, resources, trade, population, energy, military, and nuclear military power, there were 29 different scenarios, but most of the scenarios are in the early 2040s. And so we're still quite a ways away from structural factors. In other words, China's economy is going to slow down as it approaches innovation. Despite that, you're still going to get learning in China. The per capita income is going to go up. So eventually China will pass the U.S. in terms of its economy. And accounting for the slowdown in their economy puts the date in the 2040s. Now, the definition they use is Robert Dahl's definition, which is the definition of power is A's power is the ability of A to get B to do what B would otherwise not do. And the logic here is you don't look at the instruments of power, like population or economy. You look at how those things influence another actor to obey you. And so it means you might not just need enough power to be more powerful, you might need a lot more power to be able to influence them to submit to your power.